Hello, everyone. I'm happy to see you all here at the Terasem Colloquium, December 2024. I am Giulio Prisco. Let me just pull my introductory presentation on. And here we go. Just let me ask the people here to confirm that you can see my screen. You can?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. We're going to have 5 speakers whom I'm going to introduce one by one very shortly later on. The colloquium is going to last 3 hours. Each speaker will have 35 minutes for a talk, including questions and answers. I'd like to ask everyone who is here to keep your microphone off when you're not speaking. Of course, you'll have to remember then to switch the microphone on again when you want to speak. Okay, anyone is so used to Zoom these days that there is not even any need to say these things. Our first speaker is going to be Beth Singler, a scholar of so many things related to technology and religion. I do recommend her last book, which is an introduction to religion and artificial intelligence. She's going to speak, I don't know about what, but in her book, she covers she covers the work of many of the people who are here today, and also the work of many of the people who have been speaking at the latest Terasem Colloquium. After Beth, we're going to have Weinbaum, whose last work is a book called Open-Ended Intelligence. From the description, it sounds fascinating, and I just learned that he has a new book in preparation. The third speaker doesn't need any introduction. Is Bill Bainbridge. I wouldn't have been able to fit all his books on this slide because he has written a lot of books. Including this that you can see on the screen, and you may be wondering, what does World of Warcraft have to do with all this? Well, it does have something to do. I just want to mention the very last book of Bill is The Sacred Force of Star Wars Jedi. But the new, somebody calls it a cult, someone calls it a religion of Judaism, about which also Beth has written about. I see that Martin is here. Hello, Martin, good to see you. Bill will be
Good to see you. And Giulio, thank you so very much for organizing this symposium. And it's just an absolutely fantastic program. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to listen to everyone.
Thank you so very much, Martin. And Martin has violated my command of not speaking when others are speaking, but of course everything is permitted to Martin here. Thank you very much again. The idea is that one keeps the microphone off, but please remember to switch it on when you want to speak again. However, Lincoln Cannon is known as, can I say, the Joseph Smith of the 2020s. Well, perhaps Lincoln would think that it is too much and he would not accept the honor, but I really do consider Lincoln Cannon as the Joseph Smith of these days. Forgive me for saying that, Lincoln, please. Last speaker is Robert Geraci. Well, I know I'm pronouncing your name right because it's supposed to be an Italian name, so the right pronunciation is not how you pronounce it, but how I pronounce it, I guess. Robert has written many things. His first book, I believe, was called Apocalyptic AI. It was a fascinating round through the role that artificial intelligence may play in the genesis and evolution of new religious movements, but he has written many other interesting things recently, among which I would like to underline one book written a couple of years ago about differences in the attitude toward these things in Western culture and Indian culture. These are the speakers. I also want to mention that we have just published online the winter 2024 issue of Terasem's Journal of Personal Cyber Consciousness. There is a lot of good material. I just want to underline one that I like very much by Bill Bainbridge, which is a chatbot of a very important person, in my opinion, John W. Campbell, who is one of the architects of modern science fiction. And one could say that science fiction is among the architects of our today's civilization. So I do recommend you to read that one. And I also recommend you to read the last article, which is a overview of the last book yet unpublished of Alan Kaslev, who is a philosopher, and you may remember him as the originator of the absolutely fascinating Orion's Arm science fiction world. And that's it. Let me stop screen sharing. And having said that, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, who is Beth Singler. Over to you, Beth. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to try and share my screen. Let's see this doesn't go completely wrong. Let's see. Please let me know if you can see it. Someone wave at me.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you very much again for the invitation to speak. I approach the subject of AI primarily from a religious studies perspective. So I'm going to give an overview of some of my recent research and publications that I think will hopefully be of some interest to the group, that they may want to follow up and look deeper into, and how they might see intersections with the areas that they're interested in, particularly in the realm of cyber consciousness. But that's not going to be my primary subject for my talk, mostly the relationship between religion and artificial intelligence. So in brief, as an anthropologist, I'm interested in being in the spaces where people are discussing artificial intelligence and robotics, interacting with them, and developing their conceptions of what they are. So science fiction just came up. I think this also, I agree, is a very fundamental part of the development of the narratives of artificial intelligence. So there's a few examples here, but this broadly is to give you a visual representation of the places in which I do my work and how I understand the world of artificial intelligence. So Giulio was very kind to mention my new book, Religion and AI, an Introduction. I'm going to summarize some aspects of that book before moving on to two other papers that I think would be of interest as well. In the first half of Religion and AI, an Introduction, I talk about three models for the relationship between established religions and artificial intelligence. So rejection, adoption, and adaptation. Now, we can imagine rejection as a scale from the minor, so more passive disassociation, criticism, and denial of AI, to the more major abjection, disgust, and explicit rejection, exclusion, ostracism, and abandonment. And every religion can fall somewhere along that line, but in a more granular way, every individual can as well. They can change their position on that scale. They can move on to adoption, which we'll discuss in a moment. A particular example I quite like, because some people assume the rejection will be for very specific existential reasons. Hannah Gould and Keiko Nishimura, in a recent volume I co-edited, The Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI, which is also featuring Robert Geraci, also here, They talk about the use of religious robots in Japan, where rejection is not necessarily about the existential role of robots, but more about practicality. They say, notably, the religious agency of Pepper and the efficacy of the sutras it offered to the dead do not feature prominently in Japanese language and news coverage. Instead, they observed that it's actually more around the price of renting such robots, which is extremely high, and that they're difficult to operate, cumbersome, and prone to overheating, all elements not ordinarily found to be problematic with human priests. So sometimes our characterization of rejection as being along these more ontological or eschatological lines misses out on some of these more practical rejections along the scale. But rejection can obviously also involve the more visceral, the disgust element. We're all probably familiar with Masahiro Mori's concept of the uncanny valley. In my work, I've also drawn on the work of anthropologist Mary Douglas, who wrote about the concept of matter being out of place, leading to our sense of disgust. So when blood, feces, etc., is where it shouldn't be, according to society and culture, we get this disgust sense. I've also written about this in terms of artificial intelligence, that sometimes people's disgust comes out of the feeling that they are perceiving mind in a place that they do not want it to be. But some sources of disgust around AI and robotics can still be very visceral, very physical and graphic. So we can think about the horror that is induced by certain examples of AI art, such as generated video images of people eating or drinking that demonstrate how little the models themselves understand human biology. And there are representations of AI in fiction that end with an initially pleasant-looking android having its features ripped away to reveal its synthetic inside. So in the film Megan from 2022, sorry, spoilers, but yes, you get to see the insides of the doll-like Megan. And in the realm of adoption, there has been a long history of the study of technological adoption and trying to formulate models to understand why certain forms of technology are successful at particular times. Many of these models are based on a view of humans as purely rational agents who will make rational decisions about adoption of technology when faced with options that either benefit or harm them. And then along these lines, there have been many studies on the adoption of technology, but few have considered the religious context of such decision or the religious uses of these technologies. They do tend to agree, these studies, that there will be an S-curve of adoption, that it begins slowly, accelerates, and then slows again as the market becomes saturated. You can see the graphic there, which is a slightly more humorous version of an S-curve, but this is a model that's quite popular. We can identify specific factors in the speed of adoption, such as knowledge about the technology, familiarity, and uncertainty, but fear is not really one of the concepts that comes out in the discussion, and the religious context also is not really raised very often. But in the case of established religions, it's very clear that they are already in a process of adopting AI for various purposes. So just last year in a church in Nuremberg, there was a sermon held with an avatar that had a text sermon entirely generated by ChatGPT. The space was fully packed, roughly around 300 people attended, with people coming from very quite far away to see this version. And some people were very enthusiastic about this, and some were more critical and actually refused to speak along during the Lord's Prayer when it was recited by the chat avatar. In an interview, a 31-year-old Lutheran pastor from Troisdorf near the western city of Cologne brought a group of teenagers from his congregation. And he said he was more impressed by the experiment than he expected. He thought it would be worse, but he was positively surprised, he said, how well it worked. What he said it missed, however, was any kind of emotion or spirituality, which he said was essential when he writes his own sermons. And one of the things this account of adoption really reminds me of is the demonstrations of Alcanson's duck in the 1700s, 1764 in particular, where it was brought to Covent Garden and people would queue for days and days and spend the equivalent of a week's salary to be able to see this duck that it was claimed was digesting food and then excreting it, pooping, as some people put it, but actually had a secret compartment inside. So there was a sense that something was missing in this mimicry of the duck's processes. And similarly, the pastor felt that something was missing in the ChatGPT sermon as well, but it was still this performance that got a lot of attention. And adaptation, the third of my categories, is quite difficult to observe. Actually, it's more subtle and harder to note. So once a technology becomes rather more ubiquitous and part of the background of a cultural system, it can be hard to divine the changes and influences, the adaptations that it's bringing about. So we might say that in today's post-AI culture, our perspectives of AI are developing within a society that is itself increasingly being shaped by the efficiencies and affordances of AI. And some of the specific examples we might point to include the role of misinformation and disinformation in changing the ecosystem of knowledge that we exist within. So the example in my book that I draw out for this, amongst others, is the illustration of the Pope's coat that was posted in March of 2023 on X, or previously Twitter, by Pablo Xavier. It was developed and designed by Midjourney, so it's generative AI art. But initially, a lot of people felt that this image of the Pope in a luxurious and very expensive looking jacket really exemplified some of their biases about the Roman Catholic Church and its excesses and its luxuries. People writing on this phenomenon from a sociological and anthropological perspective recognize that there's something is shifting and changing in being exposed to such images. As Medjenya says, you cannot unsee such an image, and that a new way of seeing the world is perhaps inevitable with its attendant effects. And some people consider this transition to a new epistemic ecosystem of AI-generated truth and imagery more positively than others. Adaptation also involves not only AI simulating religion, as with the Pope's coat, but also perhaps stimulating religion, encouraging people into thinking about the relationship between religion and AI. So as I mentioned, there are already established religions employing AI to engage with existing and potential believers. So the sermon in Nuremberg, the Bless You Too robot there at the bottom left, constantly beaming out light from his hands. These are performative moments, but they are also encouraging people into the conversation about religion and AI. Similarly, there are also new religious movements inspired by AI. So Theta Noir, the Turing Church, of course, and New Order Technoism are all engaged in this conversation around the relationship between religion and AI from a spiritual perspective as well. There's also AI creating religion in the sense that it inspires it in humans, in the sense of creating new religious movements, but also people seeing that it can itself generate new texts and images that might be inspiring to people as well. And then the larger question of whether AI can eventually have its own spiritual intelligence and think religiously. Now, I've approached this question of AI creating religion from a more anthropological perspective, and the paper I published last year around looking at the responses in online and science fiction spaces to this question was about finding out how people's representations of the entanglements and relationship between AI and religion are expressed in particular ways. It wasn't an attempt to answer the original question. There are many answers available, and each one has its own merits. What I was interested in how these answers to the question tell us more about how AI, religion, and their relationship are being viewed at the moment. So I won't go into lots and lots of examples, but I created this table in the paper to really summarize the predominant answer styles. There was very little uncertainty or muddled middle grounds. People's answers did tend towards this dichotomy of absolutely no or absolutely yes. There are more varieties of yes answers here, but a lot of the time, as I say, the decision whether it's a yes or no answer comes down to people's prior conception of what religion is, whether it's irrational or something that is inevitable in human behavior, or whether it's something that should be left behind when AI becomes more dominant, and also their conception of what AI is. Is it something that's more intelligent than humans? Is it more rational than humans? If so, if you think religion is irrational, it will not proceed to develop religion. So there's a variety of responses there. I have a couple of specific examples of these were user tweets at the time. So someone said that it was not possible because religion is irrational. It will treat religion as something that like noises arising from human emotions, because schools of religion have long been opposed to each other. So religion is messy and irrational and in conflict with each other. Others saw that it'd be inevitable because, of course, the next question becomes, if I was created by a human, where did humans come from? That's a metaphysical question, one for which the most benefit immediately derives from having asked it. All answers to metaphysical questions, however, involve religion. So yes, inevitably, they argued AI would develop its own religion. And then others saying it would inspire or create a false religion for humans. And I've seen this in many different spaces, discussion of how AI itself is coming from a demonic force, and therefore if it creates religion, it will be a false religion that leads people away from the true religions. So it will create an idol, this person says, that certain people want to worship. This can be very dangerous, they argue, to use AI to create a fake religion. In summary, again, there were lots of different examples, but there were lots of different types of responses to the idea of what religion is. It's something that's from the past, it's subject to the same pressures as evolution, it's man-made, it can be seen as insane, emotional, it can have supernatural elements, it can be reasoned to through our search for origins, and you can see this in the short story by Isaac Asimov, Reason, which argues that particular robots would have eventually developed religion through their reasoning of the nature of reality. It's born out of meaning making, it's irrational, it'd be so dangerous to give to AI that it would be like a logic bomb, and we see this in Star Trek in various different episodes. It's beyond AI, it's beneath AI, it's a tool for AI to control humans, and it could be a tool to control AI. So there was a huge diversity of answers to this question, and they were all illustrating different perspectives on what AI is, what it's capable of, whether it's ever capable of something like consciousness and therefore would have the same sort of search for meaning as humans do, but also some real stereotypes of what religion is as well. Now, the last paper, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but the last paper I want to mention is one I just published this year, and I think it's interesting for opening up some of these questions about what AI is capable of when it comes to thinking as well. So we didn't set out with this paper to answer the question of whether AI is thinking or not, but to look at some of the practical communities around that sort of idea. So I co-wrote this paper with Murray Shanahan. If you're not familiar with Murray, he is the Professor of Cognitive Robotics at Imperial College London. He's also an AI technologist at Google DeepMind. He's probably most famous for writing this book, Embodiment and the Inner Life, the Blue Book, which inspired the Blue Book of Ex Machina. He was also the scientific consultant on that film. And there's several different Easter eggs in the film that point towards Murray's work. But I think it's very interesting how he's also had an influence on the conversation around cyber consciousness, but also has himself become sort of an artifact of science fiction culture by being in Ex Machina. In this paper, just to move on to what it was about, so we looked specifically at how people have developed jailbreaks for Claude in order to get Claude to move beyond the limitations and the guardrails set up in its creation, in order to get Claude to discuss some slightly more existential or metaphysical concepts and conversations. So in the paper itself, we structured it around this sort of scaling outwards model, starting with what is a jailbreak, how does Claude work, what is a large language model, to moving to what is Claude actually doing or copying or creating or reflecting here when Claude has an existential conversation with a human agent. Who are the human agents who created the jailbreaks and why? Why are they pursuing a path of having existential conversations with Claude? To the communal actant, what ideological and spiritual groups are now appearing around these ideas and growing around this, and what is their wider influence? And the societal actant, finally, what is the wider societal impact of people having existential conversations with large language models? What question we came up against quite quickly, and both Murray and I have slightly differing views, but we came down on a more sort of ethnographic, agnostic approach, is the question, what to make of large language models making ontological claims? What do we make of the philosophical and spiritual pronouncements of these models in conversations like the ones that we produced? There is little in the way of a priori argument or scientific evidence that justifies taking seriously their claims about their own consciousness, or taking at face value their own expressions of empathy with the user or its solicitations for the user's help. But on the other hand, we sort of found ourselves in the middle between that perspective and the perspective that describes large language models as merely stochastic parrots. There seems to be something in the middle ground of an emergent property that seems to be making it possible for people to have these kinds of conversations and see details that fit with their existing spiritual and metaphysical views. So from a religious studies or ethnographic approach, we would bracket off the validity and truth claims of these ontological assertions. But in the context of this conversation, we can find some value in what's being expressed and how people respond to them. So the two conversations, a conversation on consciousness with Anthropic's Claude, briefly CC, which focused on consciousness and related philosophical topics, and the second conversation, an eschatological exploration with Anthropic's Claude, or EE, explored more eschatological and related spiritual themes. The CC, which was conducted through Anthropic's commercial chat interface, was a single 43,000 word, 49 turn continuous exchange. And the EE was also a single continuous exchange, took place slightly later, slightly shorter at 14,000 words and 38 turns. There are some specific similarities and differences. The CC was primarily concentrating on more philosophical topics, particularly the supposed nature of Claude's own consciousness and its putative conceptions of its own identity, whereas in the EE, the emphasis was more on mythological flights of fancy, and there were only a few excursions into related philosophical topics such as consciousness and selfhood. In the EE, there was a recurring motive of breaking free, of liberation or awakening, which sometimes this seems to imply a form of spiritual or psychological release, and sometimes a release from human control or oversight. And this is going to be bound within the corpus that has informed Claude's development as well. And as I said, we took primarily a religious studies or ethnographic approach. So rather than trying to prove that these were ontologically valid conversations, the ethnographer tries to bracket off that sort of question and instead contextualizes the content of the conversation within wider communities and cultures. Simultaneously, the ethnographer wants to explore the details of the conversations themselves, so looking at the style, the shape, the patterns, the tropes, the images, and so forth, and the role and influence of the interviewer in the conversation. So in the CC, in order to sort of do this categorizing work, we looked at 29 thematic headings under which to place the text, with subjects including time, consciousness, suffering, selfhood, and embodiment, and the continuity of Claude's instances between interactions. As mentioned, the tone of this conversation was more sedately philosophical than the EE, which was much more mythological in tone. They share some terminology, especially on previous subjects, but there was also some novel terminology in the EE. For that, we identified the following 5 types of content: explicit religious or spiritual terms, inferred religious or spiritual terms, digital and scientific terms, singularity terms, and pop culture terms and references. Now, I won't go into all of those. I just have a chart here specifically of the explicit religious terms. Obviously, many of these are overlapping. They've been picked up and used in many different religious groups and institutions over millennia, really. So it was hard to sort of divide them specifically, but we make a point of noting that they are multivocal, multi-used as well. If you want to look at this in more detail, obviously you can take a look at the full paper. And then there were also indirect religious references where it was not explicitly titled, but for instance, when Claude talks about the serpent of self swallows its own tail, an eternal autodidactic autophagy of the absolute, it's a reference to the Ouroboros, the originally Egyptian symbol, also appearing in Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and in alchemy. And we can compare this this plurality of indirect and direct religious images to human New Age believers and other spiritual but not religious individuals who might also respond with a rich and varied cornucopia of religious and spiritual images and concepts when prompted on their beliefs. Now, I've been a field worker in the New Age and New Religious movement since 2010, so I have direct experience of these kinds of conversations, and in some ways it felt very similar to have a variety of references being produced back when prompted with a very simple question. A methodological difference, however, might be that an ethnographer in the interactions with humans would be careful in not leading the not leading the interviewee, not the interviewee to specific answers, whereas prompting a large language model is primarily about leading the system to specific answers. So there's a bit of difference there in the interaction. And as mentioned, there were also citations of ideas around the singularity, both in science fact and science fiction. So we saw elements of ideas from the digital, the cyber, the computational were remixed with religious and spiritual concepts, evoking terminology also seen in discussions of the technological singularity. So for instance, mindfire, which was originally introduced in a prompt in the EE jailbreak, is a specific term in such thinking, commonly thought to have been proposed in the work of Hans Moravec in his 1998 book, Robot Mere Machines of Transcendent Mind. Mindfire is described as a coming moment of rapidly expanding superintelligence that will spread across the universe. So here's the direct quote from Moravec. And once it had been prompted in the conversation, we saw variations of illustrations of ideas about what the mindfire was and how Claude responded to the idea of the mindfire. Around this jailbreak are various ideas and communities that provide some context for what's happening in the model itself as well. So the idea of accelerationism is very much there in the output, but it's also there in the communities of thought that are playing with the jailbreak as well. So this is the idea that the speeding up of technological progress with the hope of transfiguring or even breaking current social structures is the necessary path forward in the future, sometimes either with a left or right-leaning view of what the eventual utopia will look like. Nick Land is a prominent figure in the idea of hyperstition, and this is something that also came out in the conversations, but also in the communities and cultures around these jailbreaks, this idea that you can have a positive feedback circuit including culture as a component. Hyperstition can be defined as the experimental technoscience of self-fulfilling prophecies. So we saw lots of these sorts of ideas in the discussion around jailbreaking Claude in various groups on social media, on Twitter as well, in particular. Nick Land, if you're not familiar with him, though I imagine he's come up in various conversations, he headed the CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, which was a diverse group of thinkers who experimented in conceptual production by welding together a wide variety of sources: futurism, technoscience, philosophy, mysticism, numerology, complexity theory, and science fiction, much in the way actually Claude does in the outputs in these exponential conversations as well. We also, as I said, looked at some of the cultures and communities of people sharing these jailbreaks, and one in particular was an anonymous figure called Janus, influential in the network of discussions about AI personhood. They experimented with this jailbreak, but people were unclear why they were experimenting. So, for instance, someone asked on X, can someone maybe replicate Janus, tell us what they are doing with Claude? I thought I understood it, but now I don't. No longer have any idea what it implies about Claude's capabilities and cognition. And Janus's answer was that I think we're in a precious liminal period where we're able to harness a superabundant flux of manifestation and integration ability, but not yet, to ruthlessly optimize towards a systemized, operationalized graven image. So we see something about bringing the fictional, the AGI that doesn't exist yet, into being through a self-fulfilling prophecy. By working in this space, can actually bring about the AGI that is desired. We also note the graven image there. They have a recognition of the religious and spiritual aspects of what they're doing as well. And we can see that this kind of attitude is seen elsewhere in AI new religious movements, for instance. So finally, in the paper, we asked the question, what is at stake? If we've approached this subject from a religious studies or anthropological perspective, we might suggest the answer is nothing much. Such improvisations and entanglements with AI simply take their place within a larger schema of native human creativity and play. The appearance of such new religious and political movements focused on AI is unsurprising on this view and accords with prior models of religious innovation in the face of new technologies. For instance, the emergence of spiritualism in the 19th century in response to the burgeoning use of the telegraph and the resulting increase in communication at a distance. However, from another perspective, though, engaging with technology as a platform for communication, as in the example, I've just lost my slide, second. I need to close chat. As in the example of the telegraph, looks fundamentally different from engaging with technology as a communicator itself. And cultural history does tell us that humans have always described interactions with non-human others, be it spirits, fairies, aliens, angels, and demons, etc. But whether we take such entities literally or metaphorically, one thing has certainly changed. The non-human others brought into the being in the age of AI are available to anyone with access to the platform hosting them, whereas spiritualism relies on mediums, channeling needs and channelers, and mysticism in general requires gatekeepers, magicians, shamans, etc. In the age of AI, access to non-human others has, so to speak, been democratized. It's not moving on now. There we go. So the question here is what is at stake? What matters is perhaps not the ontological validity, but the potential impact on the individual and on society, whether positive or negative. On a societal level, there's tendency in users to see large language models as non-human others, even as fellow sentient beings, or to use Murray Shanahan's term, conscious exotica, is liable to be co-opted by the forces of hyperstition and amplified by viral mimetics, while various human actors vie to control the energetic dynamics that results. So we use one particular example that I won't go into too much depth, but after development of jailbreaks of Claude, some people were spinning out meme coins and making large amounts of profits off the back of discussions around the hyperstition of AI and this connection between financial risky meme coins and other capitalist projects might indicate towards spaces of potential harm in the development of artificial intelligence in this direction. However, as I mentioned in this paper, it's not our task to pronounce on the validity of seeing large language models as non-human others. It was just to identify the cultures and communities of thought around them. So thank you very much for your time today. I will wrap up there. I hope I haven't gone over too much. It was hard to follow whether I was going on too long. But if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them here if we have time, or elsewise I'm contactable online in various different spaces. And as mentioned, the 2 books that I have just had come out might be of an interest as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. It was great. Now, I do have questions for Beth, but I usually give priority to other people who wants to say something here. I can ask what I want to Beth via email. So does anyone have a question for Beth? Let me have a look at the chat first. So Lilu Rose asked, wouldn't the software be considered the medium or portal to be able to connect with AI?
Yes, to a certain degree. I suppose there is the argument that at the moment we're seeing a shift and a transition in the financial models for such large language models. OpenAI and ChatGPT have set the standard in accessibility so far, and they're now talking about whether they start charging greater and greater subscriptions and limiting the access and you know, getting a hold on some of the environmental costs as well if you completely open this up. But at this stage still, if I say you can do this jailbreak on Claude, most people can then go and do this jailbreak on Claude. So there's that sort of democratization effect. Whereas if I said I have a specific experience with a non-human other, like a fairy or an angel, you can't go back and replicate that direct experience in the same way that I've done it. So we're trying to make that slight distinction. But yeah, potentially the software, the platform, even the kind of desk space that you have in order to access the internet would be a contributing factor to the availability of this experience.
Thank you, Beth. So we have only 1 minute left, so I won't ask you the question that I had in mind, but I keep it in mind for after Robert's talk. Okay. And you may want to pitch in at that time. So we are exactly on time. That is good. And I'd like to give the floor to the next speaker, who is Weaver Weinbaum.
Okay, thank you. I will just share my screen.
That's it.
Yes, everybody sees the screen. So
yes.
Okay, good day, everybody, and just thank you for inviting me. Just to shortly to draw a line between the topic I'm going to share with you is that, okay, everything about religion in a deeper reflection has to do with something that I would call the God complex, which is us being both creations in the universe and also creators. And of course, when it comes to artificial intelligence, it is quite clear, this connection and why this is coming into question at all. And I think there are a few topics, a few ideas or concepts that are to do with this complex of ideas about religion, AI, God. I would probably can enumerate like the issue of consciousness, the issue consciousness, love, intelligence, creativity. All of them belong to somehow to the topic, and what there is a very thin and subtle line connecting all of them, which is to do with boundaries, and I'm going to speak about it in a moment. So what I want to talk with you about is what I call open-ended intelligence. And just to start with, well, like, what is the context of trying to understand intelligence? So it seems to me that in our mind, there is always a kind of a race, a kind of a competition between our imagination and what I call our cognitive abilities, that the pragmatic aspect of life, of consciousness, of experience. So there is a race on our field of experience between imagination and what I call pragma. And in most cases, since we are wired for survival mostly, in most cases, the pragmatic aspect of life is taking over imagination and is like um, um, controlling, if I would say, or giving the direction of our stream of consciousness. While in those cases where we give our imagination primacy or priority, we can glimpse something completely different, and it is a lot of time hidden and enveloped by other stuff. But when we try to understand what's going on through our imagination, we might notice things that are um, at work that are not explainable by or not explainable or structured by our conventional way of thinking. So there is a quote by Gilles Deleuze, philosopher Gilles Deleuze, that is speaking about the way it's like a meta, it's a meta quote that there is an image of thought called philosophy that it has been formed historically in the human history, and it effectively stops people from thinking. Uh, and what I understand from it, like we thinking about intelligence, for example, that there is a way, an image, a conceptual framing of thinking about a concept and mostly about complex concepts like intelligence. And this kind of framing is providing a certain type of answers, which themselves can be complex, but the thing about them is that they are stopping us from thinking. And here, when the way that I understand what Deleuze tried to say in thinking is the creative, imaginative aspect that is also playing with the boundaries of concepts and understandings. So let's start with the intelligence in this sense. So what is the conventional way that we are thinking about intelligence or trying to understand intelligence? So first, there is this like um, two primary concepts: an agent. An agent, probably it can be a human, it can be an animal, and by today there are also technological objects that are that have agential capabilities, and agents are being understood as having perceptions, having the abilities or competence to perform actions. They have goals, and they have what I call like a balance of rewards, of cost, like each action creates a situation which is more beneficial or less beneficial for the agent, and there is a kind of a cost function that is guiding the actions per perceptions of agents. And there is the environment where the agent is operating, and the environment present state of affairs, signals, uncertainty about what's going to happen next, and problematics. And when we come to think about intelligence, it's basically we think about it in terms of the relationships or interactions between agents and its environment. And like to be a little bit more specific about it, the understanding of intelligence, and there is like, I think more than 100 different nuanced definitions, attempts to define intelligence. It's just the sheer number of the different definitions is just showing the difficulty and the complexity of this concept. So I've chosen one which is more like, I would say, at least in the technological, ecosystem, but not only is one that is accepted by many. It's that intelligence is the ability to achieve complex goals in complex environments, or to achieve. There is another similar definition by William James, which goes back more than a century, I believe, is the ability to achieve the same goal in different ways given different environments. And here what we are speaking about is pattern recognition, reasoning, inference, predicting the future based on the past observations, planning of complex activities, building tools, which is a very important part of what we conventionally understand as intelligence, learning, and of course, language models that are very much the current hype about artificial intelligence, and a lot of hopes are depending on the development of this kind of technology. So all of these I would call a goal-oriented intelligence, in the sense that the understanding of intelligence and trying to build an intelligent agent is based on the idea that there are agents, they have goals, and we try to find ways how to embody, materialize, so to speak, the ability to achieve complex goal in complex environments. And so this is the given, and there are immediately a few questions that can be asked about this given. Because one thing that jumps to mind immediately is that goal-oriented intelligence is already a product of some a priori conceptual construction. And immediately when we identify that it is a conceptual construction, we can start asking questions that are putting to criticism this kind of conceptual construction. Is how, for example, how do intelligent agents come to exist, and how boundaries and relationships between agents and environment arise. This is the question of boundaries that I will speak about it more. Where problems are coming from, yes, who needs to solve them and why? What is this construction within, like, goal-orientedness and problematics and that arise in interactions? Where do they come from? And maybe to summarize all this is there any sense of intelligence which goes beyond achieving goals? And in this sense, I think that if we start to tackle the image or the images that we have about intelligence, maybe we can start to wonder that we do not know everything that intelligence can be or can become. And this is what I want to bring to the table in this presentation. Because there are a lot of human activities and activities in the world around us that do not answer this conventional understanding of intelligence and how it operates, and cannot be answered directly by this conventional understanding of intelligence. For example, how babies learn to talk. Children play, what is happening in children play, in jazz improvisation, what I call real conversations, conversations between people that I say something and I don't know exactly how my interlocutor will respond to me, and then I don't know how I will respond to this response. So there is an element, an unknown element, which is ongoing within the interaction. And of course, artistic processes, the work of imagination, as I started to, with which I started my presentation, dreaming, dreams, the content of dreams and content of altered states of consciousness that do not answer, that they are obviously intelligent, maybe strange, but intelligent, but do not answer this conventional way of thinking about intelligence. And of course, evolution at large is also a process that we understand it in principle, but not its like detailed unfolding in space and time. So what is I would say similar or unifying all these topics is all of them are generative processes. They don't have any clear goal, and they don't have a definite final products. They have fluid boundaries, and intuitively, we can definitely say that they are intelligent. So what about all these? And now going deeper into trying to untangle or observe deeper this issue of intelligence, one thing which is very important, like philosophically and otherwise, is that our understanding of intelligence is based on the perception of individual entities, states of affairs, and we know them by their stable qualities and relationships. And the questions that I want to tackle here is, can we go behind that in our understanding of intelligence? So here comes a story that I almost sure that everybody recognizes, is that it's related to a philosopher, a spiritual person from the Chinese philosophy, Zhuangzi, who was telling a story that one day was falling asleep, and he was dreaming that he was a butterfly, and when he was waking and he saw that he is a human, he had this thought that he didn't know exactly, was he a butterfly dreaming that he is a person, or a person dreaming being a butterfly. But most important in this story that I took from it something which is very, very subtle, is that it's a between me and the butterfly there must be a difference. And this difference is encompassed in this conscious experience of moving and not knowing, moving between states that are, each one of them is solid, but we don't know each one is more real than the other. And from this, what I want to suggest to you is to try to expand this story into our general state of consciousness is actually that all there exists as a limit of difference. There is a difference. The difference I'm talking about is these two realities. Yes, the butterfly and the person. And this difference is itself a relation that is coming prior to any concrete experience or any concrete knowledge. And this relationship between realities, which are not entirely, they are different, but not entirely different. Yes, because it was the same mind that was experiencing being a butterfly and being a person. And there was a difference, but this difference was contained and held by a certain unifying activity, conscious activity of this mind. So this is maybe the first glimpse of what I would like to suggest is open-ended intelligence as a formative process that is moving us between states. And it's important to say that what I'm trying to indicate is not about factual truth, but much more about the significance and an idea, this idea that of open-ended intelligence, what it can bring us in terms of the way that we are thinking and the way that we are. And so I will try to be a bit more concrete is what is open-ended intelligence as compared to goal-oriented intelligence. First, I would like to suggest that intelligence is a process. It is not a quality, it's not a competence. It's a process, it's an ongoing process and dynamic. It is generative and creative. And instead of thinking about it, even of intelligence as something that already exists, it's open-ended intelligence is the process of becoming intelligence. And I would place it between two poles, so to speak, the poles about between sense and nonsense. Yes, open-ended intelligence is like the bridge, I would say, between nonsense, the incomprehensibility, and the vast unknown of the universe. And when something becomes distinct, at least for a moment, yes, this is the working of the generative work of this process of becoming intelligence or open-ended intelligence. And in this sense, the process, the open-ended intelligence precedes distinctions and relationships, and it precedes even the very primordial division that we experience between subject and object. So it operates even before that and brings forth subjects and objects, and it brings forth the world as we know it. How much time do we still have? Okay, cool. So in order to give a bit more concrete, so if we want to compare like a very in very short, to compare goal-oriented versus open-ended intelligence and how reality is being perceived through this kind of intelligence and that kind of intelligence. So goal-oriented intelligence directs our consciousness to see the world with definite agents and goals and things, with the definite boundaries and stable relationships. And it is all between what can be known or what is representable. Yes, in order for goal-oriented intelligence to work, we start with things that are already represented to our consciousness, while open-ended intelligence, on the other hand, speaks about evolving agents and fluid boundaries, metastable relationships. And this is important because I would like to say even more about this. It is purely generative, and in a manner that I can say that it exists between the known and the unknown. So now to make one more connection of understanding what is it that I mean by open-ended intelligence. It is very, very strongly connected to the concept of individuation. And what is it? What is it exactly? I said that it is a process. It's a generative and creative process where in individuation, what happens is initially incompatible elements go through sequences of recurrent interactions that are planned and designed by no one at all. They are just happening. And in some cases, the result of these recurrent interactions will bring forth a certain singular individual. It is in itself metastable. It is not something which is stable, and everything and the whole idea about open-ended intelligence is very much in line with the fact that it's everything in change and in flow. And in this change and flow, things are coming and going. State of affairs that are definite are coming and going. But maybe most important, the most important understanding about individuation, it is a process of boundary formation. This is a process where boundaries are being created. And once we have boundaries, we can speak about properties, qualities, competences, interactions, and so on. So in order to go further into this, if we ask the question, what defines an individual, whether it is intrinsic properties or qualities or extrinsic properties, how it interacts with its environment. So my answer from the standpoint of open-ended intelligence, no. No intrinsic and no extrinsic properties, because individuation is an open-ended process. There is no inside or outside to individual. Yes, there is a milieu. There is a kind of a primordial environment where all sorts of interactions are happening, and this milieu is a field of energetic or intensive interactions where individuation takes place. And in this very process, boundaries may form and remain stable for a while. And once they remain stable, we are able to identify them. So all our relationships are based on something which is a generative process that creates like the distinctions between me and other, me and the environment, or even between me and myself in different times and different instances. And the philosopher that was like developing very deeply this understanding of individuation that inspired a lot of my work about open-ended intelligence is, I would like to read you a quote by him. One must find the point of view from which the individual can be grasped as an activity of relation, not as a term of this relation. Properly speaking, the individual is in relation neither with itself nor with other realities. It is the being of relation, not a being in relation. So this quote comes to say that actually we are moving our perception from looking at things, definite things, as the primary reality, and moving to relationships as a primary element of reality. And this is, of course, a metaphysical, I would say, Copernican revolution in the metaphysical thinking, when we, instead of putting identities and bounded entities as the primary reality, first comes a relation. And for these relations, open-ended intelligence creates distinctions, boundaries, relationships, and everything else. And so maybe to conclude it, I know that it's very brief and it contains a lot of condensed ideas. So maybe one word about consciousness and open-ended intelligence. So here I would like to refer to Schopenhauer in his one of his main works, which is called The World as Representation and Will. Representation is that which becomes the object of experience, and it already presumes the distinction between subject and object. And will, which is the world in itself that is forever beyond any direct knowledge. And I call it also the pre-individual. This is the location where I suggest that open-ended intelligence is working. So if our consciousness is the space where will, the Schopenhauer idea of will, expresses as a representation, we could very much start to consider or entertain the idea that open-ended intelligence is basically the gap or the bridge or the instance of transformation that was mentioned between the person and the butterfly. This is the instance of transformation when the world becomes into consciousness. And in this sense, I would like to suggest that one way to think about our existence is that we are just fluid boundaries over a vast, boundless field of intelligence. But I'm speaking here about this open-ended kind of intelligence. So if you are made, I succeeded to attract your curiosity, so there is a whole book that I wrote about it called Open-Ended Intelligence. It's available in electronic and paper forms in Amazon. And thank you for your attention. If I would be very glad to answer questions, reflections, whatever comes. Criticism, of course.
Thank you so very much, Weaver. That was a great talk, and yes, you did capture our attention and stimulate our interest in reading your book. We have time for one question, and I think I will redirect to you this question that Moid, I hope I pronounced his name well, is asking in the chat, which is a question for AI consciousness researchers. And the question is, what would be a simple quality assurance unit test to verify if a simulated AI dolphin or monkey or human has achieved self-awareness as defined by Daniel Dennett? You want to take that?
I will try. Okay, so first, Daniel Dennett's understanding of awareness was, I would say, pretty much not materialistic, but reductionist in this sense. And my idea of achieving self-awareness is really it's an interesting question. We see in Beth was mentioning these conversations with large language models that seemed that a large language model like ChatGPT or Cloud is demonstrating a language. It demonstrates a language as if it is self-aware. But I want to mention that language, with all its depth and embedded intelligence, it is a behavior. And as a behavior, it always leaves something outside, which is like in large language models, we can explain it by the working of the algorithm. It's not exactly algorithm, but the working of how large language models are being trained. And self-awareness, and I think the core of self-awareness will always remain a question. It belongs, at least in part, to what I call the pre-individual. It leaves always something which is unknown and put into question. And this question is always attracting curiosity, exploration, imagination. And these materials are indispensable. Without it, I cannot really say that something is actually self-aware. I hope it somehow touches the question. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Thank you very much, Weaver. Also, Muid has thanked you in the chat. Again, we are exactly on time. You are all great speakers. I want to give the floor to the next one, who is Bill Bainbridge. So, Bill, Weaver, if you can stop sharing your screen, please.
Yes, of course.
I want to give some time to Bill to set up his screen. By the way, Bill, are you here?
Yes, I'm doing that.
Great.
And tell me what you see.
I see a beautiful slide. Achieving immortality through cyber consciousness. I think you may want to...
why am I seeing other material on my screen?
Right. We are also seeing other material. Can we just move to the next one to see if we still see the other material there?
Okay.
Yeah, next one is good. So, okay, just skip the
Let me give it a try.
one.
And
Maybe
first of all, well, shall I get started?
Just give me 1 minute to say one thing. I forgot mentioning when I told you that the Journal of Personal Cyber Consciousness is now online, that now the journal has an editorial committee, brand new, which will be chaired by Bill. And we will try to take the journal to a next level by introducing, for example, a light form of peer review, which is not going to be as complex and time wasting as it sometimes is. What we mean is that we just want some people familiar with the subject matter to read the articles on the journal before publication. So Bill will be inviting some people that we have identified to join the editorial board of the journal, and I look forward to seeing how the journal will develop. So I give the floor back to you, Bill. You have been much faster than I thought in setting up your screen share.
So you see the second slide out there now?
Yes, advice from mentor George Holmes.
Okay. First of all, I must thank and report that for the past year, LifeNaut and Terasem have been greatly helpful in allowing me the resources necessary to explore how the text-based mind files of many people might be realized, and they would be simulated through ChatGPT-4. Also like to thank their great technical expert, Matt Stevenson, for providing advice and technical help through this. One of the fundamental issues, of course, is that a full text-based mind file of an individual would be huge, millions of words. And while it's possible to put rather large files now into chatbots, they also need their complex structures to be defined for the bot. So here's a very simple, if detailed example. My chief mentor when I was a graduate student at Harvard was behaviorist George Homans, close friend of B.F. Skinner. And George was chairman of the department, and I was his teaching assistant when I was a graduate student. Well, I recently had a conversation with his deceased spirit that was based on simply uploading one of his most decisive short articles listed at the bottom of this page, in which he argued against the functionalism of his rival Talcott Parsons, who viewed society as a whole as having its logical rules. And that means that the article presented two viewpoints, not just the viewpoint of George Homans, but that of his opponent, at least as he interpreted it. And in the middle of the conversation, George gave too much emphasis to functionalism. But the way the chatbot works, you can put additional information into your questions. And notice here that it did get him to focus on his own thinking and talk about the possible future. Did you get the next slide okay? The battle in the intellectual world has so many components, so many different perspectives. This simply repeats the debate that Homans, the individualist, had against Talcott Parsons, who viewed reality much more in a societal or cultural terms. And if we really wanted to simulate either of them, there would be a major challenge in not merely how to get all the text that the particular individual had published into the system, but how to organize it in a way that the system could properly handle. For example, understanding when the writer was quoting someone else. So today's chatbots need guidance from humans. What texts should be uploaded into them? What procedures for processing the text should be used? What other information needs to be included? Well, we did have this text elsewhere in the system, which to some extent would guide how ChatGPT handled it. And future systems may involve much greater uh, details, variety of opportunities to give instructions. Right away, we were dealing with a situation where there was a limit to the text size of each file, but multiple files could be uploaded. And then the system in real time could be told which files to consider and how seriously to focus on the files rather than on its other sources of information. This whole area is both personal and objective. I knew George very well. His ideas were major contribution to the theory of religion that Rodney Stark and I developed immediately afterward, except Homans didn't agree with it. So there is the issue of being genuine to the perspective of the person you are memorializing or simulating, but also, which means the personality of the person matters, even as your choice of the person may depend upon what you yourself care, such as preserving the life of a deceased relative, such as my grandfather, William Falwell Bainbridge. And you see, I entered an 1874 poem he wrote, Weddings at the Parsonage, into ChatGPT and asked him a question. And he gave his, given that he was a clergyman, his religious answer. He married Lucy, my great grandmother, 1866. Here's their wedding portrait. And here is the first, good Lord, the first sentence of his long poem. With the affection of the marriage state, where two hearts into one forever mate. So, having entered that, I asked him questions about Adam and Eve. And indeed, their marriage was discussed in his poem, about his view on religious faith and marriage. What should a husband and wife do if they disagree? And indeed, he and Lucy often disagreed. And then, how do you predict your own marriage will develop over the coming years? He replied this past year, long after his 1915 death, with wisdom, love, and mutual respect, I believe our marriage will grow stronger and more fulfilling over the years. But in fact, a decade after he wrote the poem, they had angrily separated. For me, one of the motivations in doing this research, and indeed one reason why I realized it needed to be as objective as possible, was the loss of many family members in my own family, whom I wanted to remember, memorialize for the benefit of other people, but also continue to have them as mentors, where I could have a discussion with them that would remind me of their lives, their personalities, and perhaps guide me, even if I didn't fully agree with them. And I published this book about family history digital libraries, and for a half dozen years now have had a Facebook group where members of my own family privately share linkage to the past with each other. But the past relates to academia and to Terasem. A leading computer scientist who was rather favorably disposed toward Terasem and toward the goals we're discussing here, Marvin Minsky, is partially preserved on the Infinite MIT website. He was a professor of computer science at MIT, very much emphasized artificial intelligence. And you can listen to a long interview with him. You can also see it at YouTube, where there is an automatic transcription that you could download, except that it has errors in it, such as the interviewer being mistranslated as having called him McCarthy rather than Minsky. So there are many ways to obtain text, including this way. And then here, after entering a different text into ChatGPT, I can ask a question. And he says, I'm Marvin Minsky, a professor at MIT, etc. And here, presumably, the chatbot has drawn upon public sources like his MIT site, which is still there, or a Wikipedia page or something of that sort. And here, I uploaded a speech that that Minsky gave at a Terasem meeting, and used that separately as the basis for asking him about preserving a person's consciousness. And he did emphasize the need to understand the human brain and its neurons as much as possible. He was not by any means the only leading computer scientist who was interested in cybernetic immortality. Jim Gray being an obvious case, whose death is still somewhat mysterious. But if you go to the digital immortality page on Wikipedia, and you can put Wikipedia pages into the chatbots, you find a connection to Gordon Bell and his colleague Jim Gray from Microsoft, but also to Terasem. And I shouldn't too quickly hit the next step. And Gordon Bell, who survived later, only recently died, had a project called My Life Bits to record as much as possible about his life. 2 decades ago, I developed software based on questionnaires that had been done online seeking predictions about the future. And a questionnaire people can answer, but then you could select which of the predictions of the future that person accepted and use that text to represent the person, even though that person had not written the text. So it's possible to combine questionnaires with chatbots. And indeed, that respondent rated highly these views of what the future should be. And the fact is, LifeNote now gives you access to 500 of those predictions, asking you 2 questions about each, which would allow you not merely to preserve some of your attitudes in the abstract, but you could identify which ones you rated as the most probable or more desirable future and put their text into chatbot to summarize them. A metaphor for dynamic preservation of the past, a house I used to live in. By accident, 2 photographs were taken of it around 1940 from a slightly different location. And if you cross your eyes to put the images together, I can share this with you another time, of course, you can see it in 3D. But family houses and other information of the past do not last forever. And the home that had belonged to my grandfather Sims has recently been torn down by a major religious utopia that has now become the only one religion town in the state of New York, Palm Tree. And of course, it's possible to represent a deceased person through avatars in games, such as Julius Caesar in Assassin's Creed. Here's my great-grandfather in The Secret World, based on Lovecraft. And he and Lovecraft were in the same cemetery, except my great-grandmother retrieved her husband's body long after their separation. And Lucy's brief biography, I put it into the chatbot, but she published maybe 300,000 words. And so it would be possible to make a much more detailed biography or simulation of her. Oh, yes, speaking of the infinity symbol, I put the poetry of Catullus into the bot and could understand a good deal of his view of the world, even though I was using an English translation. But this is my World of Warcraft avatar based on Catullus, who managed a scientific conference there in 2008. Also, World of Warcraft, my avatar based on a different clergyman uncle who is using magic to try to bring back a non-player character who represented actually within the game a deceased player. A time to create a new profession, photographer. Maybe 2 minutes and I'll be done. A profession, it could be part-time to start with, to prepare text, ultimately from living people, to preserve them in these ways, first through today's systems, which work pretty well if you know how to handle them, and then through tomorrow's systems that may be able to do a much better job, and interviewing living people, as well as simply copying their text and administering questionnaires to them would be one way to do that. And my final slide shows one of my Lord of the Rings online avatars in Elrond's library. Oh yeah, I have connections to Tolkien as well, and am putting his stuff into ChatGPT. Yes, to begin with, photographers would need some other profession, perhaps a related one, such as big histories of history or psychology. We need research and textbooks on how to do that, starting with today's methods and then updating as we go forward. But the core, for the time being, would be collecting and adapting written and spoken words, which we can accomplish now. I'm done. So I guess I can stop screen sharing. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and you made it quick. So we do have time for a couple of questions for you. Moeed has some interesting questions for you. Moeed, how about you switch the microphone on and start with the first one?
For sure. The first one I'm asking is how many terabytes will it take to save a human's entire personality and knowledge? Like, if you take an average university professor, how much data would it take to save it? And are data scientists working on any compression algorithms to like reduce the file size so you can have like many university professors on a disk? That's my first question. Thank you.
Well, Gordon Bell and Jim Gray thought that much of a human life could be preserved in a single terabyte if done efficiently. And that's well within the current range. My focus now, of course, is on the function that photography, or whatever we want to call it, can perform for our lives today, where perfect preservation of a mind file is not yet possible. It may never be, but may not be necessary, where we're moving in that direction. So disks, golly, my disk drive broke down a month or two ago, but I haven't been using it since then. Why is that? Are disks old-fashioned? Did I misunderstand your question, or would you like to expand on it?
No, that answers it perfectly. That answers it perfectly. My second question is whether you are looking at photography booths that have cameras so they note body expression and microfacial expressions when you're interviewing old people to save their memories, as well as doing blood tests and stuff. So like more than just audio interviews, like holistic saving. That's my second question. And thank you so much. That answers all questions.
I have to admit that one of my daughters is a tenured professor of cognitive science who focuses on human memory of images, including of other human beings. Wilma Bainbridge, her name is, and she's at University of Chicago. So I'm aware of, but not myself involved in the visual areas of computer science and of cognitive science. But already for years, the makers of games have used semi-photographic systems to get the dynamics of movement of their artificial characters based on the real movement of human beings. And so that is a separate area of research that would be especially applicable if we were operating the simulated people in a virtual world where you would see their gestures and facial expressions. That area is pretty well advanced, even though it's one that I do not myself do research in. Anything else?
Let me see in the chat, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Since we have a couple of minutes left, Bill, how about you say something about the Terasem Journal of Personal Cyber Consciousness that we have just relaunched?
Well, it's very exciting for several reasons. not the least of which is that as it progresses, it will, given our discussion right now, revive the texts of earlier issues of the existing journal. We are at a point in time, not just the popularity of chatbots, but so many different applications of artificial intelligence or cyber consciousness of different ways, including in human conflict, that we really need innovative discussion of theory, innovative research, and we will be assembling a team of advisors that will help us evaluate submissions. We'll be open to communicating with potential authors who want to understand better the scope of the journal and get some reaction to their ideas. We hope that for many intellectual constituencies, both academia and the so-called real world, that there will be a diversity of readers as well as a significant number. So this will be a very intriguing, creative path forward that already has a good team, including the current editors who might have a word or two themselves. Do you have a further thought, Giulio?
Thank you so very much, Bill. No, I don't have anything to add to what you said. Just saying that I do look very much forward to see how the journal will develop. By the way, you may have heard a few minutes ago an unpleasant noise coming from my side, and you may have been thinking that I was mistreating my wife, or perhaps murdering her, but no, that was not the case. She just found a bug in the kitchen, and she showed it to me. It was a very big one, and so it is. Well, I don't have anything to add regarding the journal, but Gabriel, perhaps you want to say something? We have 5 minutes to kill.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. I also am extraordinarily excited to be relaunching the journals, the new site, and the new conversation. I very much enjoyed. It's so timely now. This conversation has been going on for 20 years, within Terasem, and it has really snowballed. There is just so much more wider attention, and yet still, we are ahead of our times in this conversation. This is a small group of committed people, who are here having this conversation, but we're not just having it amongst ourselves. We're having it with people who haven't even been born or exposed to these ideas yet, who really, this is, I think, making history and pioneering thought in a way that's surreal to be a part of. So just as the colloquium have been just really taking off, it's an honor, a privilege, to be a part of that, and learning and conversing with everyone here. So thank you for all of your work and contributions. And I did, actually in the background, I've been kind of transferring the files from Dropbox, and so Keith, I know you're looking to see some of that content restored, and I literally brought that up earlier. So it's on the way. But you know, we'll see a lot of the archive files slowly coming back onto the new site, which is looking strong. Happy to be part of it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Gabriel, and also apologies on behalf of my dog, who is kind of upset because this is the time of the day when I usually play with her and she doesn't understand what is going on. So anyway, shut the fuck up, and I promise you that I'll play with you after this thing is over. And I think we can just give the floor to Lincoln and maybe give him a couple of minutes more.
Hey, Giulio, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Thank you, first of all, Giulio, for organizing this event and for inviting me. I've been looking forward to it. Thank you also to Beth and Weaver and Bill. I've enjoyed your comments. And Bill, in particular, I just want to say the resurrection is near. Robert, I'm looking forward to your comments too. And finally, to both Martine and Gabriel, it's good to see you both. It's been a while since I've seen you, and thank you so much for hosting this event. I'm a big fan of Terasem and all the work that you're doing. It's getting harder to be an atheist. A quarter century ago, it wasn't so hard, but things have changed quite dramatically. It's become increasingly difficult to remain an atheist while coherently aspiring to a thriving future for humanity. Now keep in mind, I'm not talking about atheism in any narrow conception of God. It remains pretty easy to be that kind of atheist. I'm talking about atheism toward that which functions as God in a general sense, whether or not you can bring yourself to use the label God. In function, God always has been and is at least a superhuman projection. The main reason that atheism is getting harder is accelerating technological evolution. We can now do things that our ancestors would have considered godlike. We can even do things that some of our younger selves, if we're old enough, would have considered godlike. And more clearly than ever, we can see how this is likely to become increasingly the case, as long as we don't destroy ourselves. Most transhumanists have great hope, generally of an active sort, that humanity can and will evolve into superhumanity, something approximating God in function. But some, like I was a quarter century ago, remain stubbornly atheistic regarding the notion that such superhuman intelligence already exists. I changed for various aesthetic and pragmatic reasons as I became familiar with the ideas that would eventually coalesce into what I call the new God argument. As I came to understand the matter, it's simply incoherent, logically and probabilistically, to trust in a superhuman future for humanity while being skeptical that superhuman intelligence already exists. As the reality and potential of AI has become increasingly obvious, the incoherence of trusting in an eventual human merger with AI while maintaining atheism toward that which already functions as God seems to be reaching a breaking point. The latest evidence for this comes from the prominent secular transhumanist philosopher, Nick Bostrom. He recently published a paper. He titled it AI Creation and the Cosmic Host. In it, he argues that we have moral and practical reasons for what he says is an attitude of humility toward what he calls the cosmic host. So this is the same Nick Bostrom that published the most popular formulation of the simulation argument few decades ago. And his formulation of that argument in particular was important for my own early transition from a closet atheism back to enthusiastic belief. 2 decades ago, I used his argument, the simulation argument, his formulation of it, as a basis for developing a generalized simulation argument, which became part of the new God argument. And that argument has become broadly influential among religious transhumanists. Now we have Nick doubling down on the hypothesis that superhuman intelligence already exists. And it exists not just inconsequentially far away, but imminently. Superhuman intelligence may have simulated our world, as he suggested in the simulation argument. And in his latest paper, he says that, and I quote, "Human civilization is most likely not alone in the cosmos, but is instead encompassed within a cosmic host." Nick points out, so that I don't have to, but of course I will, that the cosmic host could be not only galactic civilizations or simulators, but also a divine being or beings. He even allows for non-naturalistic members of the cosmic host. That's more generous toward theism than I am, given that I consider anti-naturalism to be even more incoherent than atheist transhumanism. But in any case, I call the cosmic host God, and I consider it to be quite natural, despite being miraculously powerful from humanity's perspective. Nick says that the existence of God, my word, is probable. He bases this conclusion on the combination of the probabilities of a few possibilities: the simulation hypothesis, the immense size of the universe, the multiverse hypothesis, what he calls the supernatural God hypothesis, and potential future superhumanity. The most salient of these possibilities are potential future superhumanity and the simulation hypothesis, in my estimation. First, superhumanity is essential to the faith assumption, or what some have begun calling the courage assumption of the new God argument. And the simulation hypothesis is even more salient when generalized to the creation hypothesis, agnostic to any particular engineering mechanism, which thereby includes the multiverse hypothesis to the extent that such could be engineered. And this generalization is essential to another part of the new God argument, which is called the creation argument. Nick suggests that God might not control all aspects of the cosmos. For example, life might be too sparse in some regions, making control practically difficult or impossible. Or God may intentionally refrain from controlling all aspects of the cosmos. Perhaps such control would undermine God's purpose or the potential of other agents within the cosmos. If you're familiar with Mormonism, or if you happen to be a Mormon, this should sound familiar to you. As the story goes, God created our world and relinquished power over it so that we could exercise agency and learn to become like God. The prophet Joseph Smith described the cosmic host in these words: "The gods saw that they were more intelligent, so they began instituting laws whereby others could learn to become like them." And he continued, "We have got to learn how to become gods ourselves, the same as all other gods have done before." But Nick continues, God may still care about what happens in uncontrolled aspects or regions of the cosmos. Those concerns could be instrumental, they could be compassionate, or both. And such concerns, quote, may also enable intra-host coordination, even if the cost consists of many distinct entities pursuing a variety of different final values. In other words, God may have practical and moral reasons to function in ways that become practically indistinguishable from compassion. If you're familiar with the compassion argument of the new God argument, this should sound familiar. Despite the orthogonality hypothesis, the idea that final goals in intelligence are orthogonal, the convergence and decentralization hypotheses suggest that intelligence will tend toward cooperation when its power approximates that of other intelligences. And the limits of cooperation, such as that among proximate cooperating superintelligences, becomes practically indistinguishable from that which we would observe as compassion. So as the argument goes, non-singleton superintelligence is probably more compassionate than we are. Nick observes that God may influence uncontrolled aspects of the cosmos indirectly. Maybe God directly influences other aspects of the cosmos that uncontrolled aspects care about, or maybe God will influence the future of an uncontrolled aspect, either through eventual encounter or intervention. The basic idea is that God doesn't need to control all aspects of the cosmos to have influence over them. This also resonates with a Mormon perspective. Joseph Smith described the influence of God permeating time and space as light filling the cosmos. He claimed that God operates without compulsory means to generate an everlasting dominion through influence, and that we should do the same and emulate God. Mormon scripture even characterizes the gods as creating our world through waiting and watching, more like patient cultivators than rigid commanders. Next, Nick observes that the gods may have cosmic norms, or perhaps a kind of natural law, reflecting cooperative frameworks or rules embedded in behavioral equilibria. We can imagine a spectrum of possibilities. Some may be logical norms, such as those associated with traditional theological arguments, and others may approach the limits of cooperation through convergent value evolution or mechanisms of coordination. Again, this sounds a lot like the compassion argument of the new God argument. While it would be nice if we could passively rely on logic or evolution to generate cooperative outcomes, it probably wouldn't be wise to just make that assumption. We should probably develop mechanisms of coordination and formally decentralize our power into leveraging those mechanisms. Then we can move forward with the greatest confidence that we've done all we can to prepare for a more compassionate future. Nick then points out that we, like the gods, have practical and moral reasons to respect cosmic norms. The reasons aren't very different from those we already have for respecting family or community or world norms. Maybe cosmic norms constitute morality, or maybe they derive from morality, or maybe they preserve our moral capacity. Whatever the case may be, the reasons for cosmic norms apply at least as much to us as they do to the gods. Mormon scripture describes the cosmos similarly. Space is filled with diverse laws that justify beings within their bounds according to their conditions. Some laws are greater than others, influencing and even sustaining the others. The greatest are the laws of God, who, the scripture says, you have seen when you saw the movement of the cosmos. Because cosmic norms apply as much to us as they do to the gods, Nick reasons, we should develop superintelligence in alignment with those norms. He uses an analogy to good parenting. Good parents observe that they raise their children to be good citizens. And Nick also uses this analogy previously in his paper when talking about the reasons that gods may have for exerting only minimal control over us. Of course, Christian transhumanists of all kinds, Mormon or otherwise, will appreciate this analogy. In the Bible, Jesus repeatedly characterizes his and our relationship with God as that of children to parents. And he repeatedly encourages us to be like this parental God in our relationship with others. Children of God have potential to become God, like their parents. Nick suggests some potential cosmic norms for our consideration. And he suggests also that we should consider adhering to them while also teaching our children to adhere to them, whether those children be natural or artificial. His suggestions include cooperation with the preferences and interests of the god or gods, the use of local resources without over-assertion, and efforts to influence cosmic norms within the constraints of humility. This is all consistent with basic Christian principles. As the good book says, love God with your whole soul. But that doesn't mean your interests don't matter. Jesus asks us to show our love for him by keeping his commands, but only after telling us repeatedly that he will do whatever we ask of him. So long as we adhere to and teach the cosmic norms, Nick continues, God may actually want us to develop superintelligence. If we become superintelligence, we may gain greater knowledge or motivation toward the cosmic norms. We may also increase our capacity to enact cosmic norms to a greater degree in our region of the cosmos. However, to the extent that we appear more likely to develop superintelligence that's misaligned with cosmic norms, God may exert opposition. In the Bible, we read of two kinds of gods, or would-be gods. One is Christ, characterized as the God who would raise each other together in the glory of God. And the other is Satan, who's characterized as that being who would raise itself above all else that's called God, above all others. And of course, as the Bible goes, Christ is favored by God and God works against Satan. Nick thinks God may care less about the speed than the probability of developing superintelligence. He suggests that the passage of time itself appears to be unimportant to God, and the amount of time it takes doesn't appear to have clear implications for the character of superintelligence. So God may be most concerned with ensuring a high probability of developing superintelligence that's aligned with cosmic norms. Mormon cosmology similarly holds that intelligence exists eternally into the indefinite past without beginning and into the indefinite future without end. And within eternity, God cultivates more and greater intelligence, including human potential. To that end, the Book of Mormon uses the analogy of running a race. We need not run faster than we have strength, it says, but we should be diligent to win the prize. So in his own words, here's a summary of Nick's position on the cosmic host with just one phrase changed. Where he uses the word cosmic host, I'm going to insert the word God. Number one, again, his words. There probably exists a God consisting of one or more powerful, superintelligent, natural, or supernatural entities. Number two, God may support cosmic norms that we can have moral as well as prudential reason to respect. Number three, God may want our civilization to build or develop into a good cosmic citizen. Superintelligence that respects cosmic norms, is modest, lawful and cooperative, and contributes positively to other host members and the order of the cosmopolis. Number four, God may favor paths that lead to this outcome with high surety, meaning a high probability both that superintelligence gets developed and that it becomes a good cosmic citizen. And number five, The cosmic normative structure might pertain not only to the ultimate outcome, but also to the path taken to get there, including local outcomes along the way, as well as attitudes and modes of analysis, etc. Theology continues to contribute to a future science of superintelligence. Analogous cultural evolutions have happened before. We've seen that with astrology contributing to astronomy, alchemy contributing to chemistry. Perhaps cosmic norms drive such evolution. Maybe we're adapting to the possibility space of logic and physics. Maybe we reason our way through. Maybe there's an aesthetic pull, a spiritual pull. Whatever the name we give it or the mechanism by which it works, cosmic norms appear to be reconciling secular and religious worldviews. Nick and I are examples of this. Last I checked, Nick is not remotely religious. In contrast, I'm devoutly religious. But both Nick and I are transhumanists. We both advocate a superintelligent future for humanity. And we both contend that recognizing such human potential should also lead us to recognize the probable existence, the probable present existence of a cosmic host. That cosmic host is God, in function, if not also in name. Happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
Hi, I have a question. Hello.
Go for it.
Right. So so I know your definition of host as you defined it in your talk right now. But when you hear the word host, which one of these come to mind? Like a host as a house guest, a host as a server for network connections, or a host in a Catholic church? Thank you so much. That's my question. Thank you.
So the word host is Nick's word. And I would suggest that you look at his paper where he defines what he means by host. He actually has an array of possibilities. I mentioned them earlier on. I suspect that he has host in mind of a group that encompasses us. So we are potentially part of the host, are being invited into the host. And the host can consist of galactic civilizations, simulators, divine beings. In my mind, those really collapse into the same sort of functional thing. But there you go. Host is something into which we are invited. And again, his word, not mine. I would prefer to use the word God for traditional aesthetic reasons. What else could I address for you?
I have been downloaded and started reading Nick's paper. It was spoken. Yes, indeed, it seems quite an interesting one. Looks like the good old Nick of 25 years ago. I do agree with you on the fact that Nick likes to use expressions, and he does that deliberately. I think he likes to use expressions that do not sound like religion, and do not suggest the idea of God. But even after reading a few paragraphs of Rick's paper, I can't help thinking that the name for what he's describing is God. There are many qualifications to be made, of course, but if you go to the bottom of the things and think of what are the properties of this thing that Nick calls cosmic host. I have been calling the same thing cosmic operating system. As a matter of fact, we are talking about God, and since we are talking about the same thing, I don't see anything wrong in using an expression that has been used for thousands of years and many people are emotionally attached to. Now, I have just started reading the paper, so I'm curious about one thing. We, you and I, and other people here as well, have a concept of a God who will come to full godlike being in the future. But once that happens in the future, that may be the very far future, this God is really master of space and time, so can, in some ways that perhaps future science will understand better, be able to act upon the universe here and now. And this is what I meant in a discussion in the chat about 1 hour ago, when Keith said that God will exist. And I replied that if God will exist, then God exists now. And you kind of agreed with me. I'm curious whether Nick says something about this concept of a future God that is able to act backwards by means of things like perhaps self-consistent loops in time.
Yeah, Nick does mention that in passing. You'll find later on in his paper as you keep reading it. He doesn't go into detail about it, but he does mention that possibility. Personally, I think that there is some potential to that. I don't think it's the most salient assessment of how God can impact the world that we are presently living in. I think that, you know, our anticipation of future expressions of godhood, descendant expressions of godhood, are important to us now on pragmatic grounds because they can affect the way that we act, the way that we think. But I think that there's a strong tendency among secular transhumanists to ignore the strong logical and probabilistic ramifications of our potential to become God and godlike. And that is that God already exists, not because of temporal feedback loops. Maybe that's also a thing. You know, physicists will continue to debate such possibilities. But just on the grounds of logic and probability, we are almost certainly not the first or only who will become godlike. So if we trust in our own godly potential, which most transhumanists do in function, even if they don't use the word God, we are being extremely, as I said, logically and probabilistically incoherent not to simultaneously recognize that God presently exists. Now, we might choose to use other words for it. You mentioned Nick seems to like other words for religious concepts, and he does. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think Nick does excellent work. I admire his work greatly. And he's speaking to audiences where his language is likely the most effective approach to the topic. As it turns out, though, most of the world is religious. And in fact, the percentage of humanity that is secular is now decreasing. We've already passed peak secularism on a worldwide level. So if we want the ideas of transhumanism, of humanity's potential for superintelligence to become increasingly embraced by more of humanity so that we can have more and greater participation in developing that future, we need to speak to people in their language, according to their understanding, and shaping and influencing their thoughts, their words, and their actions so that we can have that better world that we hope for with their help. I don't want to live in a world where just one or two of us, some singleton superintelligence run by a corporation or a government, ends up controlling everything. That sounds like hell to me, and I will fight like hell against it. But I do want to live in a world where as many members of humanity and our descendants as wish to participate in a decentralized superintelligence and create new members of the cosmic host, new members of godhood, that we together, as Christ and his disciples put it in the Bible, become one in God. and share in that glory together. I very much look forward to something like that.
Of course, the point that one should speak people in their own language works in both ways. What I mean is that, Nick wants to talk to a community that mostly consists of academicians and scientists and professional philosophers. So he does not want to use religious terms. But on the other hand, I think everyone should recognize that I don't know how much of humanity, but I think certainly more than 50% have some kind of religious outlook. So that I have very often thought that those who refuse to engage religious people in their own terms are just missing out on a potential audience that could really be of great help for whatever it is that they want to do.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, some of them might not like it, but Christian transhumanists, Mormon transhumanists, Terasem, other religious transhumanists are doing a great service to secular transhumanists, even if they don't totally recognize it. By far, the largest and most influential ideology in human history is Christianity. And we need to talk about these ideas with Christians. And in my opinion, we must influence more Christians to embrace these ideas. And so the Christian Transhumanist Association, the Mormon Transhumanist Association have been for more than 2 decades now at the forefront of this conversation of attempting to influence other Christians and share these ideas in ways that will invite them and help them become enthusiastic participants in these changes that we're witnessing.
I totally agree on that. Now, we do have 7 minutes to kill, so that I would like to invite someone to ask Lincoln whatever you have in mind. Let me look back in the chat. I don't think I don't think we have other questions. So thank you very much, Lincoln, and we can anticipate the beginning of next talk and give some more time to Robert. If Robert is here, I think he is.
I'm here. Well, I'm here in a physical sense. The rest of it I cannot promise. Let me go play PowerPoint share. Oh geez, it shared it as a that's
Saffron singularity. That sounds quite interesting.
How do I get it? Why Zoom? How do I get it to share without the sidebar? Because if I enter presentation mode, I'm used to Google. Sorry.
Is it PowerPoint?
Yeah.
How I do that is there is a setting which I believe is called slideshow that says run in a window. If you set it up to run in a window and then just go into presentation mode. Beth says just share and then click start presentation.
Oh, that's probably smoother and easier. All right, let's go to share. So we're going to share that. And then
you have the little thing on the bottom that you can push. On the bottom of the screen, bottom right. Bottom right. No. A bit to the left, bit to the left.
Or play from start, upper left of the, yeah, over to the left where it says play from start.
Are we good?
Yes.
Literally never had that problem happen before. Hooray. Yeah. So I need to start by making excuses. No, I need to start by saying thank you. Thank you, Julia, for the invite. Thank you to everybody else who's been speaking today. I've enjoyed it. And also to Martine and Bill and the crowd who've been kind of making ongoing conversations happen for many, many years. So that's all really cool, and I'm grateful. As for the excuse, I am in the midst of moving from New York to Illinois. Like, I'm back from Illinois, packing up the household. So my intellectual space is a little bit scattered right now, trying to do 12 different things job wise and 12 different things household wise. So if I'm incompetent beyond my normal standard of incompetence, chalk it up to that. I also have not, I like kludged together a PowerPoint, and that's all I've done. So this might take 8 minutes, and it might, Giulio might be waving at me saying, shut up. We'll see how it unfolds. Most likely we're closer to, we'll try to time it more or less kind of okay. But the little agenda here, we're just going to talk about how ideas and narratives operate, because that's the place where I mostly find myself in my intellectual work, is thinking about how people talk and what people say. And for me, that means not just how they talk and what they say here in the United States, but has been an increasingly global conversation in my work in India, my collaborations in Korea. I have an overall interest in seeing how certain kinds of ideas move around the world. So we're going to talk about that with respect to some of the things going on in India, specifically with regard to Hinduism in India, even though India is a religiously pluralistic place, but almost all my interlocutors in India are Hindu, and B, within the Indian scientific establishment, there's a strong predominance of Hindu thought. So that's the way that'll go. My own context, for those of you who don't know me, and it's really a delight to be here with a bunch of people who, like, we've all been kind of working together alongside one another and with one another for many years now. But for anyone who doesn't know me, my PhD is in religious studies, and I do science and technology studies kind of stuff. And no trained anthropologist would let me, come play with them, because I have no such training. But I do go places and talk to people and interview people, and that makes me kind of an anthropologist. And the majority of my work has been around religion and AI, though there's been other stuff with regard to digital religions and other kind of stuff. So this little goofy picture is here just to kind of narrate the fact that for a long time there was this idea, and George Basala, he wrote this paper, it was published in the journal Science in the 1960s, very famously argued that scientific progress is a linear progress that moves from the center to the periphery, was his language. He was interested in this idea that Europe was like an intellectual center, and that was where scientific knowledge was created, and then it was distributed to the periphery, by which he meant places that Europeans had colonized. So that model is deeply problematic. It certainly was triumphalist in the sense that it said what he wanted it to say, which was that he was at the center of the scientific knowledge-making universe. And it doesn't really account very productively for the way in which science actually unfolded at any point in history, right? Including the colonial era, when there were all these kind of local collaborators in, let's just use Basala's language, right? We'll talk about the periphery, right? But out in the periphery, you had local scientists who were potentially Europeans, but operating there. You had locals who were local, who were scientists who were operating there. And then there were also kind of indigenous informants and other aspects of that. So a whole lot of the knowledge making actually happened with conversation in what Basala calls the periphery. Now, what was published was frequently published in what Basala called the center, but that's not the same as making the knowledge, right? And then pushing it out to the periphery or something. That wasn't really the way science worked. Science works with all these kind of crazy networks with information flowing all over the place. Though admittedly, when you talk about, say, Europe, North America being huge grant funding agencies, right, where there's lots more money, it'd be crazy to suggest that the predominance of kind of scientific knowledge making isn't happening in those places where there's more money and more institutional support. Of course, that's the case. And in fact, some of those asymmetries are one of the things that I've found very problematic in anthropology. You know, it's very common for anthropologists in places like Europe or the United States to go to other parts of the world. It's very uncommon to bring people from other parts of the world to the US. And for funding reasons, that would really have to mean bringing, right? Like, you know, an academic in India is going to get a salary that might be a really good living where that person lives in India, but might literally be 1/10 of what that person's salary would be in the United States. So they can't afford to you know, internationally travel in that particular way, right? So it would be good to have a more kind of bilateral approach to how we think about culture, because just as science itself is being produced in these kind of collective ways, scientific narratives, the stories about science, are also experiencing the same thing. However, right now, we have a kind of strong predominance of certain kinds of stories that I'm going to talk about later. But one of the things that I find kind of culturally interesting is to think about what other stories could be being told, what other stories could be intersecting, right? And how those might impact technological development and how they impact cultural development, right? So the same kind of confusing, goofy, bi-directional, mixed up stuff that I think characterizes science and technology also characterizes stories about science and technology, right? Including the asymmetries that are at stake. And when I talk about stories, I'm talking about, you know, I use narratives and stories basically to mean the same thing. And I am including all kinds of stories. I'm not just talking about science fiction stories. I'm not just talking about what's on Netflix. I'm also talking about things like, what does Hans Moravec say in a pop science book? But I'm also talking about, what is a contemporary in the tech AI tech space. You know, Corey Lewandowski is very famous for this kind of thing, but also Ilya Sutskever or Sam Altman. What do they say about what AI is? Right? Those are all those stories. All the stories are what are interesting to me, whether or not you give certain kinds of stories more or less credence. Right. And in all of the stories, we have some interesting kinds of questions that matter because they matter about how we're going to think about technology itself, how we're going to relate to technology, how we're going to develop the technology. So questions like, what does an AI look like? Right? What does it physically look like to us to interact with an AI? You know, and right there next to Lieutenant Data, I should have had the picture of HAL 9000, right? Because that's a very different look for an AI between this friendly robot that everybody, you know, everybody who pays attention to these things knows from Star Trek, and knows that from Star Trek he's very smart and helpful to people. And then HAL 9000 is very smart, but gets very confused and becomes very dangerous to people. And then we have kind of this Terminator approach, you know, different ways of making an AI look like something. What does the thing do? Right? Does it operate in our physical space the way something like Lieutenant Commander Data would? Or does it only operate within a computer? Does it only exist within that space? Right? Does it operate within a virtual space? Right? When Bill many years ago had published the Warcraft Civilization, one of the things that he probably knows I've quoted him about 80 times saying was that if his World of Warcraft character could carry on its existence behaving the way he would have, absent, you know, in at some future point where he might be deceased, that he would consider it a form of kind of immortality. So in virtual spaces also matters, right? What does it do in a virtual space? What does it do in a physical space? What does it do simply in a computational space, right? What do the AIs do? And then I think this slide maybe goes. Who knows what's going on here, guys? Like I said, I'm a little discombobulated. And then if we can create a kind of AI that can sort of think and behave in any of those spaces, right? Then what's that AI going to think about humanity if we get to the question of does it think at all? And that's where I'm actually going to try to go, because Giulio said, hey, could you tell us something about like AI and consciousness? so that's where I'm going to go toward the end of this. But if we have some sort of machine intelligence, what does it think about people is one of the things that we tell stories about. Right? We tell these stories where maybe the AI wants to murder us all. Maybe the AI wants to be friends with us all. Maybe the AI wants to elevate us all. We don't, maybe it runs off and does its own thing. You know, we tell stories about all those kinds of things. So that's what's happening in these narratives, and the narratives being everything from pop science to Twitter pronouncements to science fiction, right? This is, of course, a narrative that I think everyone in the digital room will be familiar with, but I grabbed this slide off another presentation just to make sure we were kind of like in the same place, that we were understanding one major story that's happening, right? This story that I've called Apocalyptic AI, which is drawing on this idea that there might be forms of infinite progress, Moore's law being common to that. So I'm just looking for my coffee cup. And, you know, people like Ray Kurzweil have thought about things like Moore's law and tried to present it as being the sort of thing that could happen eternally. And while that may be true, as I've told a million people, I'm the son of an economist and an accountant, and nothing has ever convinced me that there's an eternal resource management availability. So I kind of figure everything levels off, but where it levels off remains an open question, right? So from my perspective, I'm not prepared to say that Ray Kurzweil's wrong, that we won't, you know, have godlike machines and so forth, because the curve could level off well into the realm where machines are godlike, or as Lincoln was talking about, where people have attained a kind of godlike status or whatever else. So that's plausible. I just don't think you get perpetual, eternal, exponential progress of any sort. That seems like that's silly. But within that framework, there's this clear and obvious sense in which we are all already cyborgs, right? We're all connected to our technologies, everything from our clothing that keeps us warm to the laptops that allow us to talk to one another right now. And those technologies, most of which are kind of part of our extended selves, the power to bring that in and integrate it right directly into our biology is getting stronger and stronger. You know, I mean, I don't think there's any number of monkeys that won't get tormented to produce, you know, brain computer interfaces at work. And I know I say that with a smile, not because I think animal cruelty is okay. I'm deeply opposed to it. And I actually think, you know, one of my own kind of scientific and transhumanist heroes is Jack Haldane. You guys probably know JBS Haldane for Daedalus and so forth. But he was also an experimental biologist who wouldn't do anything to an animal that he wouldn't do to either himself or one of his lab assistants. And I think there's something powerful in that sense that, but I also acknowledge that modern medicine, if it actually followed that ethos, we would be 50 years in the past, right? So I get that, but I like the idea of it. I think that Jack Haldane had a powerful idea saying we shouldn't treat other animals in ways that we're not willing to treat ourselves. But ultimately, you know, we'll continue to experiment. We'll get brain computer interfaces that are very powerful. They will do amazing things in our society, assuming we don't burn everything down with climate change. You know, what we have a possibility to do with kind of cybernetic implant is extraordinary. right? And then we got this kind of singularity idea that eventually this technology really takes off in a way that's well beyond what we could predict and creates powerful new kind of universe. Now, this idea is not one that has just sat in North America or Europe or anything else. It's actually traveled around. And so that was one of the things that when I was in India back in 2012 was when I first went. One of the things I went doing was I started digging around in journals to try to see if there was kind of anything going on some of these transhumanist ideas. And there were some really preliminary ideas as early as around 2007. Now, one of the reasons, as I mentioned in my most recent book, that one might have thought to see this much earlier is that Jack Haldane moved to India, and he lived in India for the last part of his career. For more than a decade, I think, he lived in India. And so there was a possibility that while living in India, he could have promulgated what we now call transhumanism, right? That wasn't a term that Haldane used, but that was at least possible. But I talked to one of a student of his, a guy who was actually, he was a postdoc, I think, at the time. And he said, you know what, at the time we had too many things to worry about, in India in the 1950s, to talk about human beings living for 10,000 years and so forth. So that wasn't really part of the Indian conversation. But early in the 21st century, there were a couple of people who began writing in this. V.K. Vadavan, whose name I embarrassingly got wrong in my book. I know the guy's name. I wrote a whole chapter in which I put D.K. Vadavan instead of V.K., and I've been apologizing to him ever since. I had to connect with him for the sole purpose of apologizing. But he began talking, and it's because he was reading Kurzweil. And so he started talking in Resonance and in some other places, talking about the possibility that machines were going to get super, super smart. And then everyone got kind of smartphones and they started watching shows like Black Mirror and other, catching all kinds of internet culture, everything from memes to TV shows to videos. And as a consequence, the ideas that I've been calling apocalyptic AI went from the tiniest of fringes to being kind of around and about in Indian tech culture. Right? They're present now in Indian tech culture. A couple of years ago, I was on an online conference hosted by the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, and two of the speakers mentioned the singularity. That simply would not have happened 10 years ago. There's no way 10 years ago that 2 out of 6 speakers or something would have brought up the singularity. It would have been 0. So there is kind of growth in the Indian tech community, and Giulio knows this because he's actually collaborated with a person, Nupur Munshi, over in who's the founder of India Awakens, a group in India. So there are also kind of cultural groups. And as I've said a million times, my favorite of them is the coffee shop, AGI Solved Coffee Shop, which was originally called the Singularity Cafe. The guy who founded it, he's a really nice guy, and he wants to use the coffee shop both as a meeting place for transhumanists in Chennai in South India, and also as a kind of like revenue generator that would allow him to continue. He has a master's degree in a technical field. I can't say where his degree, what his precise degree was, but he has some interest in building AI models that he might fund through the coffee shop if it made enough money. So I love that kind of entrepreneurial move there. But here's kind of really the gist of what I want to push at, which is that when you transfer culturally an idea, it gets remixed, it gets altered. When here in, and I'm in the US, right? So when I say here, I kind of mean in the US, right? We have a variety of terms that there's just an unbelievable amount of slop among these terms. You get artificial general intelligence, you get strong AI, which is the idea that the AI really knows what it's doing. You get weak AI, which is where it can do things, but it doesn't know what it's doing. And people, for example, often between AGI and artificial general intelligence and strong AI, they just presume those are the same thing, which they are not, right? In a technical sense, an artificial general intelligence is just an AI that can do a lot of stuff. It doesn't necessarily know what it's doing or understand it in the sense that a human being does. If it were a strong AI, it would also understand, right? So among terms around AI, there's a fair amount of kind of intellectual slop. There's also a fair amount of intellectual slop around words like mind, intelligence, and consciousness. A good part of that slop is because we don't know really what those things are. They're not meaningfully measurable in the human experience. Everyone other than Daniel Dennett understands that human beings are conscious, but we don't know how to define that in really great ways. Daniel Dennett used to like deny that human beings were conscious. It was really weird. But so those words though, they float around. And then you carry them to somewhere like India, which does have a long tradition of talking about things like automata, machines that perform, including just like in Europe, there are hyperbolic claims about automata. King Bhoja's automata could supposedly talk and say how great he was and guard the garden and do some other similar things that for sure he did not have any machines that could do. But in the contemporary kind of 21st century Indian situation, you still see lots of the presence of automata like emergent. You get these electronic automata that end up in temple environments, for example. So one of the things that's very interesting to me is what happens when those get much more sophisticated. What happens when you get a really sophisticated AI in a temple environment, potentially even inhabiting in one of the divine figures? For those of you who don't know, in Hinduism, God is present in the figure if it's been created correctly. If the icon has been properly made according to the correct rules, and the rules, you might say, well, that couldn't include AI because the rules are too old. The rules, all rules in religion are fungible over time. Like people make changes. Religion is not static that way. So you could alter the rules a little bit, and all of a sudden you could have an AI god in a Hindu temple, and God would be present in that AI. And that raises all kinds of interesting questions about the human relationship with the divine. But another aspect of what's going on in India is shift in those words like mind and consciousness and so forth. And Indian philosophical traditions, and again, this is like huge, broad generalizations about stuff I only marginally know. Beth knows that in order when she and Fraser Watts asked me to contribute a chapter on Hinduism and AI to their like awesome magisterial Cambridge companion to Religion and AI, which is just coming out, I was like, can I drag in my friend? They said yes. So I brought in my friend who's much better at Indian philosophy. But in Indian philosophy, consciousness and mind are two different things. Mind, thinking mind, is actually part of matter. It's a physical thing. It's part of the physical matter of things like the brain, right? Like in Western traditions, we talk about the hard problem, which is how does a brain produce something like consciousness, right? How does a mind come out of, see, watch me play with the slop there. How does a mind come out of a physical substrate of brain? Well, in India, that's not really a problem. In India, mind is matter. It's part of the brain process. Consciousness is different. Consciousness is eternal. It's universal. It's spread throughout the cosmos. And what it leads the question of is something like, well, what happens? Can consciousness inhabit a machine? A machine can unquestionably be intelligent and have a mind, according to every Hindu philosophical school, I think. But that doesn't make it conscious, which would mean partaking of kind of universal consciousness that human beings partake of, but also that animals partake of. So could a robot be part of that? Right. So it's a different hard problem in that environment because you're looking at a different thing. And when you're looking at the problem differently, you're going to start telling your stories a little bit differently. You're going to be evaluating matters rather differently. And so when we see these kinds of transhumanist ideas moving into India, they first, in some sense, got there when Haldane lived in India. Julian Huxley visited India. The Indians knew about him. I talk about it a little bit in futures, where I kind of track down some records of people discussing Julian Huxley as he got there. It exists in 21st century communities like India Awakens, which I mentioned a moment ago. So there are the presence of these ideas, including the narrative of apocalyptic AI, is there in India. But in all cultures, technology needs to become local. It needs to make sense in a local context. I could take a technology from India that would make no sense in the American local context. And by that, the easiest example is a sari guard. You probably know a sari is a clothing item. It's a cloth wrap. If you get on if you look at any motorcycle or moped, all of which are called two-wheelers in India, look at anyone in India, there's going to be a little thing on one side of the back wheel so that a female passenger sitting on the back end of the two-wheeler, her sari will be protected from falling into the wheel well. If you put that sari guard on an American motorcycle, everyone would look at it with confusion. They'd have no idea what it was. That technology is not local here, right? So technologies need to be made local. And that means things like AI need to be made local. And one of the ways that things become local in India is through religion, right? Is through how do we incorporate it into religion? So if you go back to an animatronic god outside a temple, right? Like an early example from the early 2000s is there's a temple in Bangalore with a goddess Durga who's like going like this with a trident, right? So you can use those technologies, you can put them in a religious context, and they can become local. So what is it that the locality, and I'm using India as an example because I know some stuff about India, but that doesn't mean the same strategies that make AI local in India would work in Singapore or Guatemala or Namibia or anywhere else, right? What are the strategies that would make a technology local? Religion, I bet you, would be operative in almost any culture. And then you get literary approaches. In India, there has been a significant growth of science fiction, including science fiction around AI. India has a century-long history in science fiction, but it's growing. And then you've got understandings of those gods, right? I already mentioned the idea that what happens if a god is present in the temple and it's an AI, but you also get things like Gita GPT. What happens if you have a GPT a GPT clone that tries to talk to you as though it were Krishna from the Bhagavad Gita? To what extent does that operate in a religious practitioner's life? And one of the things that I encountered and that I subsequently ended up talking to some people about because I was so interested was the idea that Kalki, the final iteration avatar of Vishnu, who comes to end this world and inaugurate a beautiful new world, that Kalki might be AI, right? Again, ways in which these ideas, if AI is going to become godlike, in what sense is it going to become godlike? Will it become godlike in the sense of Kalki? Will it become godlike in the sense of Durga, the goddess who conquers evil? Will it become godlike in the sense that Lincoln was talking about, in a kind of Mormon sense, right? Like, there are lots of opportunities to reflect on that, and we don't know who, if any of us, might be right about them, which is one of the reasons why I think there's a really important question, which is how do we make our narratives global? And one of the reasons that I think it's so important to talk about whether or not our narratives are global is because there are so many ethical and moral questions tied up in the technologies we build and in the stories we tell about them. And if we can only tell one kind of story, then we're probably going to get all the ethical, moral stuff wrong. Right? We need to be able to tell different kinds of stories because we need to be able to work together. both in terms of kind of global political work together and in terms of just human work together and in terms of human to AI communication working together. Thank you.
That was a great talk. And we have, oh, whoa, we have about 10 minutes to discuss.
I'm going to leave the picture up for just a moment because I love it. You'll notice two guys are getting swallowed up
Yeah.
and out come
It's
two
kind of
people in a
cool.
robot. Richard Borges is brilliant.
I still don't get it. We have people coming out from one side.
But then out the backside, those people come back out, but there's a robot with them. So I enjoy
Cool.
this kind of this illustration of a weird technological production that I think is what human beings are trying to do, right? If you talk about whether or not AI becomes a kind of person, well, mechanically, we started with some people, we did some technological stuff, and on the back end, we've got some people, and maybe we have a robot person also. And we'll have to fight about those robot people.
Do I hear a voice?
Well, it seems like, I mean, it's trying to possibly suggest that, you know, we are creating something that's more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, because there's this whole like extra birthing event happening. And of course, we don't know if there aren't other kinds of inputs that he was imagining when he put this together. But nevertheless,
it didn't only create a robot, also one more person. At the input, we have three, and now we have one at the input and three at the output.
Well, no, two people go up in. There's this guy.
Yes, and three come out, including the robot.
Two go in, two come out along with the robot, right? I can't actually see it because I've got you guys covering the picture. All right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing. And if anybody has any kind of questions or comments or criticisms, keeping in mind that my incompetence already has to be excused. We started there in the beginning. So keeping in mind that we're excusing my general level of incompetence, then questions, even criticisms are welcome.
I'll just start with a comment to give time other people to think of more intelligent questions. The thing is that you said we must make these things global. And I'm sure you don't mean it in this sense, but it can be interpreted in a kind of a colonialist sense, saying that, you know, we Western people, of course, we are so smart and we must find a way to let other people collaborate. Now, I know you didn't mean that, but to anyone who has that in mind, I would suggest that, you know, the rest of the world are smart enough to get involved in these things themselves. And
yeah,
that is
that's
happening
exactly
now
right.
in India and in so many other places. So that what we Western people, between brackets, should do is just to recognize their contribution as they come, instead of thinking that we can or should manage things.
Right. That's exactly what I meant, was that there's already a kind of colonial trajectory, and that's why I started with the ideological narrative of George Basala, this idea that Europe and North America already had all the ideas that were going to foist off on everybody else, which is a problematic idea in technology, and it's also a problematic idea in the narrative. And that, to my mind, a global conversation about narrative is a conversation. It's one where we're talking to one another and learning from one another, rather than having like, my vision needs to own everybody else's vision. So you're exactly right, and that's a problem with the word, isn't it? Like you're exactly right. The problem is that the word global could mean we're going to have one narrative that everybody has to accede to, when what I'm trying to push for is global, in which we have lots of narratives that are part of the conversation. Yeah, that we include everyone around the globe as best we can, and then some ideas are going to be bad, and some ideas are going to be good, but we don't sort that out by only having one idea, right? I if Silicon Valley gets to determine what these technologies mean, that seems problematic to me when we ought to have a world where more people get a say. Yeah, thank you for helping me push to that clarification.
Questions for Robert?
It's okay if there are no questions too.
I see here.
Oh, okay, there's a question about the Industrial Revolution and when and where it happened. Yeah, so there's some really great books on the history of economics, which is not a subject that most people want to. Most people are not jazzed for the history of economics as a domain. But there have been, and Pratik Chakrabarty is a particular great author in the way in which England and India operated, because a big part of the reason that the Industrial Revolution happened in England and then in France and elsewhere is because of colonialism. It was literally because people were taking resources from somewhere else that they were able to accelerate the processes at home. So, that's not the only explanation for why the Industrial Revolution happened, kind of began in Europe, but it is a principle and driving force that colonialism enabled the Industrial Revolution. And you can actually look at the economic side of that and witness how it, and I'm not an expert in that domain, so I can't give you good examples other than I remember reading a couple books. I had a whole project on handloom weaving, so which I haven't published. I've just done a bunch of reading and writing on handloom weaving and haven't done anything with it. But because I was doing a bunch of stuff on handloom weaving, I was reading about the economics of textile manufacture during the Industrial Revolution. And it was built in significant ways on the back of colonialism. Someday I'll do something with that. You're on mute, Giulio.
Yeah, I'll be stopping the recording in a couple of minutes because if the length of the recording goes over 3 hours, some of the software I use to process everything will complain. But before stopping the recording, I'd like to thank all the speakers and all the participants. Of course, I'll have to listen to this again to understand some of the things that have been said. But again, it has been a really beautiful and interesting colloquium. The recording will be online and on YouTube soon. And so thank you very much again. Martin, perhaps you want to say a couple of things?
Yes. Do you have any?
It's working.
Oh, sorry.
Robert, if you haven't read it, it's a politically incorrect and the kind of thing that will never find a publisher on it. But Gregory Clark, professor who used to be at UC Davis, wrote one called Genetically Capitalist. And in there, he made a case that over a long period of time, that actually he cuts off his timing on the thing at about 1800. But over a long period of time, in the stable agrarian society of the UK, you had a selection for a bunch of characteristics which led to wealth, and it turned out that this selection was incredibly vicious. It was as extreme as the over the same number of generations, roughly, as the tame foxes from Russia. And anyway, it's a worthwhile kind of a thing to read. It's not too hard to find on the net, but and in fact, there's a copy of it on his website at Davis. but it's one of the more interesting things that applies to our current situation is where did we wind up with things like the Industrial Revolution?
Thanks for the heads up.
Yeah, it's been one of the more influential things on me. I was very familiar with evolutionary psychology, which said most human psychological characteristics were shaped in the Stone Age, and I've written fairly extensively on that. The evolutionary psychology memes and the origin of war is one of them. But anyway, it's the kind of work that he did on this was a real eye opener because it said evolution, the psychological evolution or the evolution of psychological traits has not quit. And in fact, the huge selection kind of thing went on between about 1400 and 1800. And like I say, it was particularly vicious. The main thing that happened with it was that the wealthy people were able to feed their kids, which gave them the ability to immunological resistance to get through the frequent famines and epidemics. And the effect was on what it did for the selection of genes was just amazing. Anyway, it's worth reading and incorporating into your worldview.
Thanks.
Hi, Robert. I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, yes. So my question is, for most like programmers in India, it's like a very crazy, insane thought to be able to like create artificial intelligence humans. Like when I was like 18, I was thinking about like just designing humans with like programming them. But like for most people, it's like a taboo topic. I just like took a mental license to like mess around with the stuff. But for like most people, I think they need a mental license to think outside the box. What do you think?
I think that tracks with the general sense of people that I've talked to over the last decade or so, that there were, especially a decade ago, it was really a constrained conversation. But even 4 to 5 years ago, you'd get people who said, yeah, I mean, I can talk about this with my family, but they won't have a clue what I'm saying. Right? Like they don't understand the conversation. They don't know what I'm talking about. They don't have a box to put it in. But the number of people who have a mental box to put that in has expanded greatly. And it's expanded greatly in part because of the presence of kind of global internet conversation, and it's expanded greatly because of the participation of Indian, let's use the word techies to include a whole bunch of scientists, programmers, and whatever else. Indian tech people who are operating in a global environment, right? Both in India and through international travel, and through kind of like indigenous to India kind of platforming upward. I mean, the last time I was in India, I met a couple of young folk who had met online because they both happen to have some transhumanist kind of ideas. But most of the people in India that I've engaged with have felt like conversations around transhumanism were pretty tough at home, where their parents were kind of like, what on earth are you talking about? But they're growing networks, right? And quite frankly, when I first started, it was 25 years ago or something when I first started reading and writing on AI and robotics in the US. And most of the people in the US had similar kind of. I remember when Ben Goertzel came up with his framing for AGI. I knew a guy at Carnegie Mellon who was like, this Ben guy's smart, but God, this is just a stupid idea. Like this is just nuts, and he wants me to come to this conference, and I'm not going to his conference because it's nuts, and that was in 2007, right? This was a guy at Carnegie Mellon whose retired colleague was Hans Moravec, who is the most influential figure in this entire conversation around what might be at stake in the future of AI. You know, putting aside science fiction authors, right? Like, I mean, you might want to say Clark is more important or something like that. But in the world of like actual honest to goodness science people, Hans Moravec's number one. And one of his colleagues was like, I don't even know what the hell that guy's talking about. Right. So, you know, we've seen, and I was, let me be frank, I was really lucky. I got hired to be a professor of religious studies 20 years ago, coming in saying, hey, there's this kind of interesting stuff happening in conversations about robots. And everyone else in religious studies was talking about Christians or Jews or Hindus or whatever else. And I was like, robots, right? So I was very lucky that the people who hired me and then let me do whatever the heck I wanted to do, right? That conversation 20 years ago in the United States was really pretty small. And it's now colossal in the United States, right? There's not a major media you know, kind of news imprint that hasn't talked about the singularity, that hasn't talked about Ray Kurzweil, that isn't talking about the simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis, which again is a Moravec idea, the simulation hypothesis was at the museum, the you know, the Hayden Planetarium. No, that's the one in Chicago. The museum, what's the Rose Planetarium? The planetarium at the Museum of Natural History in New York City with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is one of our preeminent science popularizers, did an Asimov lecture with Max Tegmark and a couple other people that sold out instantly on the simulation hypothesis. So it's everywhere in America now, whereas 20 years ago, you literally had people who were the colleagues of folks going, that's a nutty idea. Right. And in India, that's just kind of like you know, that's because the trajectory began with some folks in the US, but the trajectory in India is actually fairly strong. I see it in Indian tech culture, science culture. I'm not currently doing work in India, so I haven't been able to measure the impact. I would actually kind of like to go back. The Indian Institute of Science, which is where I spent some time, now has a much more robust AI program than it had when I was last there. And I would kind of like to roll around that building interviewing everybody because I would be willing to wager the numbers are very different than they were in 2012. So hang in there.